All right, Connie, thanks for coming on today. Appreciate it.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here with you, Mr. Clark.
Yeah. So yeah, you ran one of the sessions for the ATA Institute Day, and I was intrigued because I find a lot of people will come on and they talk about like kind of the um I always say it's like the FDR's New Deal of like acronyms of like kind of the things that we're all kind of paying attention to. So one of your main focuses was like ODD, and then it was ADHD and autism, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So why that lane? Why that interest? And like, what do you feel like you've learned so far that you think is valuable to educators?
Well, honestly, that's who I've always worked with since I started my
Mhm,
career. I've always worked with the kids that are a little misunderstood. They're on the
mhm,
fringes. They have behavioral problems that don't allow us to easily teach them. And that's who I've always loved. And then
mhm,
I've even had my own boys. Definitely have a little bit of that in each of them. And so even having to parent it has been fun.
mhm. Yeah, and because the one of the main reasons I was interested in the autism part specifically was I remember like you always hear about kind of the theoretical part of okay, like someone has autism, there's a spectrum of autism. So I guess I'm gonna try and throw out to you what I think I know about autism, and I want you to try to like piggyback me of what I should know or what I'm wrong on. So there's an autism spectrum. Autism essentially boils down to like different kind of emotional processing in social situations. It's kind of the main part. Is that kind of what I am I on the right track a little bit there?
You're doing
Um,
great.
okay, and then I think when it comes to, but I guess my question is, depending on like how do you analyze for a certain area of the spectrum and how are they different?
Well, and see, this is the problem is that the spectrum is so vast.
Yeah.
Like you'll hear words like that's a high functioning that child has high functioning
Yeah.
autism, low functioning. But what's so ironic about that statement is that that child could be high functioning in one area, but low functioning in others. So maybe they're high functioning in the ability to communicate, but their emotional ability to emotionally regulate is very low.
Mhm. Okay.
So it's really not a very accurate way of saying to identify where they are on that spectrum. I
Mhm.
like what you said. We have to understand that they have a problem processing because that executive functioning in the brain, it's
Yeah.
just not there the same way
Yeah.
others
So
are.
what does that like I guess I might be like asking the wrong question, but I guess I'm wondering what does it mean by executive functioning not processing the same way? Like
It's
how
kind
is it
of
different?
yeah, like it's neural pathways in the
Mhm.
brain. Actually, very much the same as ADHD. Certain
Mhm.
neural pathways have just not connected. And that's why perhaps not being able to speak very well, or to be able to have motor skills for some, or literally literacy skills for others, or social skills, like that part hasn't connected.
Okay, so is would it be fair then to say that autism is kind of in its like what you could see on a brain scanner, I guess, would be a difficulty making connections in more areas than like a neurotypical person? Is that kind of what is
Yeah.
meant by that? Okay. So, because I guess like there's no way to, I guess, cure autism. So I guess how do you know when you're like making progress? And I guess do you have any stories of like students or people that you've worked with autism that you've seen improvement in like what you've done with them?
Yeah, like definitely. I do
Mhm,
think that we can see improvements as we have predictable
mhm, mhm.
environments that are supportive. But again, it's so vast. I've seen students, I used to teach mental health and resilience through hip hop circles in schools.
Okay.
That's what I
All
would
right.
do.
Yeah, I like
I'm
it.
a
Yeah.
break dancer
Well, no,
underground.
but I think that's what we need is I think kind of the traditional like textbook format just even if it is true doesn't really connect with especially kind of like the younger educators like myself. I'm just thinking like if you gave me a textbook of like a playbook of what to do, I'm just like this is boring. I don't know. I guess it kind of needs to be fun, I guess, to try and maintain the interest because it can be very exhausting if you're like continually working with some like younger autistic children and like feel like you're getting nowhere. And it's not even that you are exhausted necessarily with them, it's I'm exhausted with myself not knowing what to do. You know what I mean? That's kind of been my experience as well. I have very minimal experience working with like children with special needs, but that's what I would say. So how would you kind of handle the well, I guess I'll just jump into an example. And I worked at the Autism Society in a city here, and my first week was a kid. He was a nonverbal autistic. He was 7, and before we even went in, we did an exercise. The exercise was, "Okay, Lucas, I want you to tell me that you want me to take you upstairs, walk you across the road, go to McDonald's, and get you a chicken nugget meal with fries without using any words." And I just remember, like, I used to go, like, Happy Meal? That was my best way of trying to, because I guess my understanding is they're still thinking in the same way with language. Is that correct? Even if
That
they
could
are
be.
nonverbal? I'm not really
Yeah.
sure.
You know what? It's so I'm not exactly a
Mhm.
huge expert, but
No, no, but
so I'd say that you're right, but I mean, it really depends.
yeah,
But yeah, like you said,
yeah.
how do we communicate without words? That's such a great exercise.
Yeah, and I just found it so eye-opening in terms of trying to actually see the world through someone else's perspective who literally cannot speak. But
Yeah.
yeah, and I think I guess one of the things that I would think about is you do a lot of stuff with trauma with your Bring Them Closer series with your more recent work. And I guess kind of like a connection that I'm noticing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's always a need for the preparation for the change in environment. Meaning, if you have like an autistic child or any child at all who, like, let's just say we create the perfect conditions, perfect world. We have this educational utopia. Everything's going well. We have consistency. The same teachers there every day. The same EAs are there every day. We're, but maybe it starts to work in the classroom and we see progress. We see better kind of communal connection. But then we go to the gymnasium. And then all of a sudden the dysregulation hits and the uncomfortability hits. I guess like in all of those areas, how do you kind of but how would you advise to, like, for that adjustment of, like, changing? I guess, do you just kind of tell them flat out, "We're gonna change," or what are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, you're brilliant. Like, that's exactly it. So I just want you to know,
Oh my
a lot of
god.
teachers are like, "Man, do I need to understand autism?" Or, "No, you
Mhm,
don't. You need to understand what you just said, that
mhm,
the environment, that we're creating is what's going to guarantee success here." And so, like, let's say they're moving from your classroom to the gym, and you know that there's going to be disruption. You know that there's
mhm,
going to be dysregulation. I do think that verbally saying things does help, but I also think that practicing it helps. So,
mhm,
2 things create an environment. Well, 3 actually. Emotion, which we often forget about because we don't think emotion has anything to do with education, but it has lots because that's what creates the environment of how we feel. But then also language. So, speaking out verbally, but then also practice. So, we're going to have a practice run going to the gym so that we know how this feels. And then we know that these kids are going to fumble around and there's going to be some stuff. And we might do it 5 times because repetition is also really important
mhm.
too. By the time we actually have to do this thing, it might go a little bit easier.
Yeah, because 'cause you're actually getting into the point of, now I know everything in my surroundings, so there's not really any kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like, sensory surprises, is that kind of the word that I would look I don't know. I'm just
I
kind of
like
throwing
that.
something out there, okay.
I'm going to borrow that.
Um, okay, yeah, well, I mean, go ahead. But that's interesting that you say that because I was kinda looking through skimming through some of the notes from your books. So you've written 2 books? 3 books
Well,
so
I've
far?
written 4, but the 2 that are
Okay, sorry,
relevant,
okay,
to bring them
okay,
closer, there's 2.
okay. Yeah, because you have a first edition and a teacher's edition.
That's right.
Is that correct? So how did you I guess when you're speaking in different contexts, because I assume you like I've seen on your social media, you are giving a lot of talks. How do you kind of adjust your message depending on how you speak with like a normal, I guess, non-teacher crowd versus a teacher crowd? Not saying teachers aren't normal, but
You heard it here first,
yeah.
folks.
Well, I mean, we're not that normal. But
Well, I like to look at the whole work of bringing people closer as a coming back to being human,
Hmm.
um, embracing our humanity a little bit more, and how do we connect with anyone in relationships. I really love to study this concept of interpersonal neurobiology, how we
Okay.
deeply impact one another. So, whether I'm a parent, whether I'm teaching in the moment, whether I'm relating to my partner, whether I'm just interacting with friends, our human relationships are very, like, the way we do them is very similar. And so my bring them closer is 5 steps on how do we actually bring hurting people closer in all aspects of our life, but I focused each book on teachers or on parents.
Okay. Yeah, because that's one of the things that I found was super fascinating. Because I did my kind of armchair psychology reading there a couple of years, and that just to kind of look skimming through some books. But one of the main things I thought was super interesting was the idea of like mirror neurons, and I assuming that's kind of what you're. Is it interpersonal neurobiology? Is that what you said? Yeah,
That's right.
where it's you pretty much like I always said, if I'm having like a crummy day and my wife's had a great day, it's almost that you subconsciously bring their mood down to like level. It's like a seesaw that kind of brings you back to kind of equilibrium within yourselves. Would that be accurate? And that's like, I guess, how do you manage that once you're aware of it?
Well, and being aware of it is honestly huge because I don't think I liked how you mentioned the seesaw. That's a really great visual of how that impacts. And I think that we have to be able to differentiate our mood from others, from our spouse, from our kids, our
Mhm.
students. Once we're aware of, oh, that's possible, well, now what I do is I think about, okay, well, how am I feeling? What am I thinking? And how am I responding to this? And I literally now can do that very quickly. But when I was first kind of fumbling around with this a little bit, I really had to sit and be intentional with that for 10 minutes. Like, how am I feeling? Because if we haven't, we're not taught to be inward like that. I call it attuning in so that we can attune out. And a lot of us are just trying to attune out. Like, oh, just connect
Mhm.
with your students. Well, then we wonder why we fumble. It's because we haven't attuned in first.
And it's probably, I'd say, the most discussed topic in teaching is teacher burnout. And I do think that one of the ideas is that they always say, okay, self care is not taking a bath, which is fair. But I think I, I I would say that trying to maybe perfect is the wrong word, but hone in on trying to make the process of attuning to yourself a bit more of a practical habit as like one of the main things that I would say has helped me. Because I was gonna ask, one of the like academic cliches is like research is me search. So is that your experience in kind of this lane of just like trying to figure yourself out in the process, or was it just kind of like something that was interesting and then you decided to follow it?
A little bit of both, but I actually it's
Okay.
interesting I liked how you said that because it's so
Yeah.
true. We learn things, but then we have to kind of try it on ourselves like that. And I love that you talk about that inner attunement as being the self-care strategy because it
Mhm.
is. Teachers are always telling me, stop telling me to get a better sleep or to eat better. I already know that. So how do we actually take care of ourselves? And that
Mhm.
is it, that inner attunement. How am I feeling? What are my thoughts? Those subconscious thoughts that are allowing me to respond or react in certain
Mhm.
ways. And how am I responding and reacting to the people around me? That's all
Mhm.
in here. In here.
So was that like a habit that you developed, or how long has this process kind of taken for you from like when you started, and does it, because I guess my thing is I've gone through, so I'd say my psychology armchair period started because my dad passed away about 4 years ago, and then so I was 22, and so that kind of started my like, okay, how am I feeling? What can I learn about how I'm feeling? And how can I the goal was to I don't want the way I'm feeling to interact negatively to make things worse for anyone around me. So that was kind of my process with that. And I would say like you still have bad days, bad moments, but I would say overall I've become much more aware of kind of where I am emotionally. But what would be your experience with that?
Well, that's powerful, first of all, that you would do that, because
Mhm,
grief, that's a whole other level. And grief has many emotions to it. And so just knowing that you could allow yourself to feel all those things is so, so important, and how that would impact the relationships around us. For me, honestly, it's more, I'm not trying to get to a destination. And I think
yeah,
we are very interesting as a society. Like I said, I'm constantly trying to bring people back to the beauty of humanity. And when we're trying to, like, well, I need to take care of myself so that I can be emotionally regulated for these students, or I'm trying to take care of myself on the inside so that I can be the best spouse. And those are
mhm.
good things. But if we're trying to get to a ta-da, now I'm a great teacher, ta-da, now I'm a great spouse, that's not being human. That's trying to achieve something that I think we're only going to be let down. I've been on this journey now for 8 years, and I'm like you. I've had days where I'm like, man, I was so attuned to myself. I was so attuned to everyone around me.
I
And then
am a
there's days,
stoic philosopher.
yes, I could write a book. And
So
then
I guess
other days I'm like, I should never have written a book. I am a complete
yeah,
fraud.
okay.
I am a human.
Okay, alright. So, 2 interesting things there. 8 years. Why does that stick out, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, we all have points in our life, pivotal moments of our life where we notice something changed for us. For
Mhm,
you, my dad passed away 4 years ago. That's a
mhm.
pivotal moment. For me, my son was hospitalized 8 years ago. That's a pivotal moment. That's when I noticed I started to do something different because I had to.
It's like a bit of a paradigm shift, kind of an unexpected paradigm shift, yeah. And so yeah, and I think that's someone most people can relate to. It's like there's just kind of like a tragic incident for the most part. I mean, most like living is, if nothing else, suffering. So, but I'm wondering, as you were kind of, I probably, if anyone listens to this, I talk about imposter syndrome all the time. It's probably one of my favorite ideas that I have never experienced more intensely of feeling like an imposter in almost everything I do. But so, when you have moments of I should never have written a book, what do you think to yourself?
Well, I think if only I did all these wonderful things all the time, never failing, never dropping the ball. If I followed my 5 steps every single day, then I should have this book out there. But the truth is that that's denying humanity. And I find that when I'm being an imposter, or I feel like an imposter,
Mhm,
I am denying myself of my humanity. And I think that we have to come at our humanity with a little bit of humility,
mhm,
with, I'm probably going to get this wrong a lot. And
yeah.
that's why I talk so much about creating brave spaces over safe spaces, because brave
Okay, so what's a
spaces are
brave
about,
space? Yeah.
yeah, brave is about, I'm going to do whatever I can to connect with you, no matter how I feel. If I fumble, if I fail, I'm going to own it, but I'm going to repair. A safe space is I'm trying to keep myself safe. I'm trying to preserve myself. And I find that imposter syndrome, at least for me, in my experience, I'm trying to preserve myself. I'm trying to look a certain way. And when I don't look that way, or if I haven't met my own expectation, I'm really upset with myself. And so therefore I
Mhm.
should never be a teacher. I should never help teachers. I should never write a book because I
Yeah.
suck.
Well, and I think in trying to navigate my imposter lens that I viewed myself, I had one professor just tell me straight up, "It's weird if you don't have it." And I said, "You know what? It's the people that say, 'Oh, I've never experienced that.' Like those are the ones you should kind of be wary of because there's things they're not reflecting on that they probably should be."
Yeah.
So with the Bring You Closer series, so you kind of what are the 5 steps?
Well, the first one is peace in my heart means
Mhm.
peace in my classroom for the teachers,
Okay.
or any environment that I'm in. So that's that
Mhm.
inner attunement. The second one is behavior is communication. My behavior is always communicating something deeper, emotions and thoughts that are there. My students their behavior is communicating something deeper. Um, Belonging creates resilience. So how do I make sure that I'm cultivating my own sense of belonging so that I can create that out there?
So what do you mean by your
Resil
own sense of belonging? Because
well,
when I went through, when I went through some of your uh, like table of contents for your books, I was kind of looking for things that popped out to me. But the belonging creates resilience really popped out. So would you mind expanding a little bit more on your kind of thought process behind that one and why that title?
yeah, for sure. So it's interesting, like even going back to those breakdance circles that I would do in
Mhm.
schools, I would form a circle. And by the time we had gotten there, I had taught some breakdance foundations to students. And
Mhm.
I didn't speak to those students. I would look at them. We would attune, but not with words. And if I had done a good job of making sure that my eyes, my face, my body posture was very welcoming, by the time we got to that circle, there was a sense of safety that had been there. And I would say to the students, now everyone's going to get an opportunity to go into the middle of the circle to dance. Now, my favorite were grade eights because they were hilarious. They would instant
Yeah.
sweat, right?
Like, please
Everybody,
don't make me go in the circle.
that's right. And so it was interesting. It wasn't about everybody going into the middle of the circle, it was watching who would go in. And often it was these students with autism, with opposition, the ones that lurked in the shadows of the school, they would be the ones that would go in the middle of the circle. And I would always ask them at the end, if you went in, what got you into the middle? And they would say, well, I felt like I wasn't going to be judged. I felt like I was safe. I felt like I could risk and fail and no one would be, looking down on me. And so what I did was I actually studied that concept, belonging creates resilience, through 20 years of doing this over and over and over. And I noticed when those circles had that judgment-free zone, and when I attuned inward to myself before I got to that school, and if I could attune with those students, I noticed that the resilience to push through that awkward situation, that actually became quite high, rather than if there was judgment or if I was having a rough day. I just noticed when belonging increased and when it decreased.
Mhm. So, because I think about trying to get some of my students into a breakdance circle, and I start to sweat. So, but I'm just wondering if you how would you go about trying to create judgment-free zones in your classroom? If you're not in like an environment where you can kind of, because I know the primary premise of that is rhythm. Is that right?
That is
You're trying
correct.
to establish rhythm because that way I can't remember the science behind it, how it kinda, like, syncs everyone up. It's kinda like that mirror neurons thing. It's kind of like an all in it together a little bit, so you feel like everyone has the opportunity to risk. Is that kinda what am I on the right track in saying that?
Yes.
Okay.
And I find that judgment-free zones really get accelerated in a time when everyone is feeling this is a risk. Like even the dancers in a circle feel this is a risk because
Mhm.
they want to get it right. It puts everyone on the same playing field. And so I find that if we can find teachable moments that bring everybody to a common ground where it's like, wow, this is risky for all of us, I think that creates a judgment-free zone because everybody's in that same place. Now, those situations might be hard to figure out, but
Mhm.
even celebrating risk, what gets celebrated gets done. I've heard that saying. And I think it's
Okay.
true. I think when we, as a teacher and in a classroom, when we can celebrate when somebody fails, when we can celebrate when someone's trying, I think
Mhm.
that all of a sudden this culture of, oh, so you mean I don't have to get it perfect? That starts to be the norm.
Yeah, because I think the idea of do you think that perfectionism is becoming more prevalent among students?
I think so. I think the pressure to have certain grades in order to,
Mhm.
even my youngest son is in grade 8 and he's a pretty good 70s student and he's always
Mhm.
talking about how he's not smart enough. I'm like, where's that coming from? You're a good 70s student, but he thinks that, oh, I got to be reaching higher. And Yeah.
Well, it's like compared to whom? That's kind of the self-comparison thing I think is rampant. It's something that I've struggled with in the past. I think everyone does to a certain extent. I think growing up, you're always looking at other people and what they're doing and how am I relative to the people around me. That's kind of your primary gauge of if you're doing things well or not. But have you ever considered self-comparison within the work that you're doing?
I think that would be a huge thing,
Mhm.
self-comparison. And that's actually a lot of that inner belonging work that I talk
Mhm.
so much about is brave belonging, that I belong. I can do things my own way. I wasn't born to fit. I was born to create. I look at what you do as a teacher. You have a podcast. You're clearly, you think deeply about things. And in a world where maybe it's just about, did you get your report cards done or this and that? Do we have the bravery to create something that's unique to us in a world where it's like, no, this is the way it's done. Just stay here, stay in this box.
And so how do you sorry, you're getting me right into my creativity rabbit hole now. I read the book by Rick Rubin. I'm not sure if you're sure. Called The Creative Act.
Oh,
Phenomenal. And it was interesting because like when you kind of picture like like a conventional book would be like your okay 15 chapters broken down into whatever format. He almost wrote them as it was like over 200 like one-page chapters. It was a very completely different, but his idea was trying to break a norm of some sort in actually creating a creative book. So I guess how would you how do you try to instill creativity into your kids?
I welcome their opposing thoughts.
Mhm.
So, for example, my oldest son, when he was given this diagnosis of oppositional defiance, it was
Mhm.
often because he was challenging the norm all the time. Why are we doing it that way? I don't want to do it that way. It's like, well, how would you do it? I love hearing what they think. Like my oldest son, when he was 8, said, "Why do I go to school? I can learn everything I need to know on YouTube." And instead of shutting that down and saying, "Well, you don't learn any kind of social learning on YouTube," I'm like, "That is interesting. That is true." And why is that true? Like, instead of shutting things down, and I think oftentimes if it's not the right answer or the answer we're looking for, it's like, how do I shut that down quick? Instead of leading with curiosity. That's one of my key values in my own personal life. Is
Mhm.
how do I keep curious rather than closed?
Okay, and so I actually I was not aware that your is it your son, sorry, has oppositional defiance disorder? Is that
That
correct?
was a diagnosis. Yeah.
Okay, and so I guess my question is I would say oppositional defiance is arguably one I know the least about. In just that oppositional defiance disorder, I guess what would be the difference between that and just being a generally disagreeable person? Like what is what is the like I guess the category for because then you'll meet people who are like, oh, they're just disagreeable, but then what is kind of that line where that reaches ODD?
So this is interesting because I actually don't believe in this diagnosis.
Okay, okay, yeah. All right.
In 25 years, I can and with working with students on the fringe, because that's who I've
Mhm,
always loved. I have never met a student with that diagnosis that I would say, "Oh yeah, for sure, that's bang on." Because if a person is truly oppositional and if they have a disorder that leans towards that, that means that they will always be oppositional in
yeah.
every environment. And I've
Mhm,
never seen that. Even
mhm.
with my own son. It was more if a certain environment was a certain way, the need for control grew. That's what I notice with opposition. And to be honest, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
And well, yeah, because I one of the things that I found interesting was I didn't read all the way through it, but it was a book called Brain Energy, and it kind of talked about the like thread between it's almost like if I'm trying to picture it, if you like threw something at a wall and it splattered, it's like trauma kind of like splatters into all these different areas that are then categorized as these different diagnoses. But I guess when it comes to being an educator, it's Well, if that's the explanation, then what do I do with that? You know what I mean? Like how do I just deal with, okay, I have a student who may or may not have ADHD or may or may not have ODD, but it could be a root of trauma that's causing the symptoms that are reflective of these traditional diagnoses. But now I have to teach 35 of them about the Cold War. So I just don't like know how I grapple with that. But what would be your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, there's definitely a few things that come to my mind. I always tell
Yeah.
teachers, there is a part of your profession that you really do have to kind of let go. So not saying that
Mhm.
we don't try, right?
No,
You have
because there's
to,
only so much one. Yeah.
but when you think about it, I think the teachers that are really suffering the most are the ones that are tying their entire identity and their idea of success to whether that kid makes it. And this is what I say to every teacher. My kids graduating from high school is not your responsibility. It's mine. I'm the parent. Now, I wish every parent thought like that, but
Mhm.
I think that it's important for every teacher to understand like there's no way you can hold 35 kids, their destinies on your shoulders. Like you're there to teach them. Now, that being said, there's a couple of things that we can do. I don't believe that every teacher needs to be trauma informed. I think that we're putting way too much on plates. I think you're a reader. I love that, but you choose to read.
Mhm.
Some teachers don't want that. They don't want extra pressure. And so trauma informed in one sentence for me that I could give is what's that student's story from their perspective? And if you could just keep that in mind and find the things that they really connect with. They're not going to connect with everything,
No.
but find when you do, it's like great. Let's do that. And maybe you'll never, and that's the other thing, that's the ambiguity with this whole journey is like what
Mhm.
if I don't reach every single one of those kids? Well, you might not, but the next teacher might. So pressure off.
Yeah, because that's been one of the things where I kind of have like an internal 10% rule of like if I come into contact with a student, I want you to be 10% better than when you left. Whatever that means. Maybe, but again, even 1% is fine. But understanding that in one semester, I'm only one of four that you're coming into contact with, and I'm one of 70 that you might have throughout all of your K to 12 education. So understanding that if a kid does not connect with you, that's not always on you. And it doesn't necessarily need to be you who's the one that's kind of there to, because there's a teaching is almost kind of a, you have like a weird savior complex associated with your profession. It's like you're almost like you're expected to save my kid from everything that's bad, but then do that for 120 of them. But then I don't know. And but then it's also the I really like what you said about not having every teacher to be trauma informed because it assumes that all teachers are the same and are going to have the same kind of skill set or um like interpersonal skills to deal with every student in the same way.
Yeah, because I think then we don't allow teachers to find their own special way that
Mhm,
they educate. And I
mhm.
think as a society, we need to be aware of how trauma impacts us all. But really, it's about the stories that everyone's bringing to this classroom, the stories that people are bringing to their homes. And it's like, how do I just hear your story? And people tell their stories all the time through their behaviors, through their emotions, through the things that they write. And I don't have to do
So
anything about that. I just get to notice and stay curious about myself first and then maybe them.
so I have an interesting in my own kind of probably overly introspective brain. I read so I'm not trying to book dump here. When I was reading The Body Keeps the Score,
Oh, so good.
but he talked about sorry, is it Bessel von Kolk? Is that the name for that
I
one? Or
can
am I
remember
getting that mixed up?
Vanderbilt,
I
Render,
can't remember,
yeah.
but I remember he said like look for the unexpected signs that you are in flight mode. And I remember reading it, and I would honestly remember, like, sometimes I would notice my shoulders were like this, and I would actually have to, like, actively push them down. And this was a weird one, this next one. I would be brushing my teeth, and I'd have my left calf tensed up. Like I'd be like leaning on one side and like, but that's your whole body is currently in strain tight mode. Like you're not letting yourself kind of relieve. So I guess my question was, when it comes to being a teacher who is trauma informed and trying to kind of take that role, it is one thing to, okay, the student has a certain story from their perspective that they're communicating to you at all times. But is the only way to deal with that is it just not personalizing what they say? Is that kind of the like if they do react, it's just not saying, okay, this isn't me. It's like, and not necessarily them. We're just dealing with a symptom of something. Is that kind of accurate, would you say?
Oh, that's huge. Separating their choices, words, everything,
Mhm,
and being able to differentiate. Again, your mood does not affect mine.
mhm,
You know, you're angry, I'm not. And that again comes back to that inner attunement. The more I can understand what I'm feeling in the moment, those mirror neurons are actually connecting us. And sometimes I would find with an angry student or anyone who's angry, I would notice I would get angry. Why am I getting angry? It's those
yeah,
mirror neurons. So that art of differentiation becomes very important.
because I've also had it where like students will not even just students, but people will like say things to you, they just fester a little bit.
Yeah.
And like you'll go home and you're cooking supper and you're like, I just can't get that out of my head. And for some reason, I think that when you come back to that attunement kind of work that you do, it's easy to like take a step back, understand that the thought is just a thought, let it breeze through, move on. I think that's become helpful because sometimes, like, if you're specifically attacked in front of 30 other people, that can be something that sticks with you. But I
Yeah.
think it takes a lot, and obviously it can be something that weighs on you, especially if that's happening all the time and you're seeing that same student all the time. But I guess, would you have any advice for teachers who are kind of maybe more, maybe what's the, if you're a teacher who is more likely to accept criticism that's unwarranted, you know what I mean? Like if you're, like if someone's attacking you and you personalize it and think it's correct, like how would you kind of intervene there?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I don't think it's the right answer. Like that's just a one shot, but I'm just wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, oh boy. I mean, I've definitely had it when some student has said to me, like that was the worst class ever. I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, I guess that was the worst class ever.
You're like, what? You weren't here yesterday? No.
Yeah, right. I'll never forget this one grade 8 girl. I had just finished speaking at a mental health assembly, and
Okay.
she comes up to me and she says, you speakers, you're all the same. You just say the same thing over and over. Guess what? We're not listening. And I'm like, wow, like, did I ever bomb that? I love grade 8s. They are my
But
favorite.
they're honest.
They're
Like they're
honest.
just gonna tell you how it is. And you
Yeah.
know what? But I guess my thing is like that's still feedback. You know what I mean? Like that's still not
Yes.
nothing. Like you don't have to take it as like, okay, maybe there is something I can do to like tune up what I'm saying. You know what I mean? That's again,
Well, and you know what
yeah.
I heard her say, like after I kind of got over the blow,
Whoa.
um, yeah, I
Nice to meet you
actually,
too.
yeah, it was very abrupt. I was thinking about it after, and I thought, this is what I think she's actually saying.
Mhm,
Stop telling us how to be well and start showing us. We're tired of these assemblies. Start
mhm.
doing something different for us. And whether that's what she was really saying or not, or whether she was just thought she's having a bad day, might as well pass it on to me. That ended up making my talks better in the future because I thought
Mhm.
they're looking for something more. Um,
Yeah. So, do you have, again, no pressure here, but like, was there anything that you kind of, as you've grown as a speaker, that you've like certain seeds that you've made sure to plant in your speaking that you've been incorporating?
well, I think again, these young ones, they're so much more interested in experiencing things rather than being talked at.
Mhm.
I think that the days of, say, assemblies, I don't know how effective they really are. And that's
Yes.
sad that I'm saying that because that's part of my living.
Yep.
But how do we bring them into an experience with us? And how do we model it? I think that's the other thing I'm hearing from a lot of young people is, can you model for me? Like, instead of teaching me about how to emotionally regulate, can you show me what that looks like? How do you emotionally regulate? What does that messy middle look like? Tell me the truth.
Yeah, and so it's interesting you say that because how does it feel? What does dysregulation feel like to you?
Oh, it feels
Like,
like
how do
chaos
you? Okay.
for
Yeah,
me.
yeah, and so how do you? What makes you recognize it, and how do you regulate yourself?
So I think, I've come a long way, but before I actually, if I could use a metaphor, it felt like a Katy Perry song. You're hot, then you're cold, you're
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
then
yeah.
you're no, right? It's like I didn't know what mood I was in. I'd
Yep.
be like, "Oh, I'm fine. No,
Mhm.
I'm not." It would be abruptingly yelling at somebody for no reason, easily irritated, not able to get a grip, not able taking everything personally and then
Yep.
exploding later. And so for me, again, those three questions I ask myself every day, like, okay, Connie, how are you feeling right now? And what does that emotion sound like as a sentence? So if I'm feeling like a little insecure, maybe that sentence sounds like, I just don't feel like I'm really good at teaching because that kid said that, or I'm not a good speaker because that grade 8 girl said that. And my behavior was, what I wanted to do was totally gaslight her. Like, what are you talking about? That was fantastic.
It's like, clearly you need to do more reading, okay? Get out of my face. No, I'm just kidding. Um, but what I was talking to one of my colleagues the other day, and he said something that was really fascinating because I guess I've always kind of assumed that when I'm regulated, he said being regulated is not being perfect. And I was like, whoa. Because I guess when I think of myself being regulated, because sometimes I don't know what the difference between being dysregulated is and just being on a caffeine crash is. Where I don't know if like is coffee my regulator, but like there's something about when you have like your peak teacher moment, your coffee is going down good, you feel like you're communicating well, and but that's a feeling of perfection that's only a moment. That's not regulation over a long period. So what are your thoughts on like the regulation not being perfect necessarily? Like what does
Oh,
being regulated mean?
Oh, I love that it's not perfect because I think people
Mhm.
think like we need to have this complete steady presence, but like that is a flat line. That's dead. So
Yep.
there is a wave. We have to allow ourselves to feel and to fumble. I love that. And that's honestly why what I do is I notice my emotion. I notice my thought. I notice what my behaviors are. But then I put that thing in a box after I've asked myself that question every day, and I put it in a box and I'm like, and I'll deal with that now again tomorrow.
Mhm.
Because I think that if we
Okay.
go through our whole day thinking, well, I just need to be emotionally regulated, we're so fixated on it, we're not even having fun. And
Well,
now we
yeah,
will
like you
never feel joy.
well, yeah, because you're almost overly introspective. I would say this is almost the unintended consequence of like the wellness movement, is
Yes.
that people are almost, oh, if I'm unwell, I must be dealing with trauma, or like they're kind of maybe even looking for things that might not be there. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of the because I've heard like the big T little T trauma kind of distinction, and but when it comes to little T trauma, that's very hard to decipher. Have I or haven't I? You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
that's kind of been like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Like the unintended consequence?
I couldn't agree more with you. And I
Mhm.
think what it's done is it's actually taken resilience away from us. We're not resilient anymore because we think, oh, like this has happened to me, therefore now this is where I am. And it's a disease model of mental health. It's focusing on you are not
Whoa.
mentally
Okay.
well. Whereas I like to move people forward to, okay, so we've had horrible experiences in our life, but maybe the hardships of my life have actually created resilience. Um, what I wrote over myself when I was going through a crisis with my family was, I am brave. I show up when it's hard. I love without walls. I forgive when it hurts, and I rise through the storm. I did not write that when I felt that. I wrote that in the midst of adversity that was forming that in me. So
And
adversity forms us. And so we're trying to all run away from adverse childhood experiences. I have a real problem with that, because my boys took those tests, and I walked away from those tests going, wow, I've really effed up as a mom.
mhm,
And instead of that story going, okay, this is where you are right now, but there's actually a new way to create new stories, new neural pathways, ways forward, and not with going with positive toxicity way over here, but to know that actually we can rewrite our stories and we can move forward. I don't know
mhm.
if we hear that enough, because we steal people's resilience when we keep them in their teas.
Yeah. So, how has your kind of idea of resilience changed? And I'm gonna edit this piece out. I'm just gonna go close this blind quick because it's blocking the sun on my camera. Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right. So, how has your like idea of what resilience is changed between like when you started versus now?
Well, it's interesting. When I started, I was working with drug dealers and gang members, and
Okay.
they
So,
were
when were you
nothing
working
but
with these?
resilient. What's that?
So, when was this work happening?
1997,
Okay. And
1997 to
so, were
2004.
you a teacher? Like, what was your kind of like traditional educational path at first?
Actually, more mental health and resilience, and
Okay.
doing a lot of social work on the ground in the front line. And then I moved into doing this work in the
Mhm.
schools. I was the school mental health
Okay. Yeah.
resilience, and from there just kept going. Schools then became my main line of work. And when I moved to Calgary, it was interesting because these kids who were drug dealing and these gangs, like, they were resilient, they were resourceful.
Mhm.
And then I moved into affluent communities where I noticed that resilience was less. But what I also noticed at the same time is, as a society, those at-risk youth were losing their resilience too. And I think sociologically, I don't know if I'm right, but it seems to. Oh, I hope my dogs don't bark. Okay, there we
That's
go.
all right. Don't
Um,
worry about it.
it seems to, as we have um, given people more of this interesting wellness message,
Mhm.
I've seen resilience lessen.
Hmm.
So we need to focus on trauma. We need to make sense of our story. We need to be aware of adverse childhood experiences.
Mhm.
But what we then do with that needs to build resilience, rather than say, well, I guess I had this experience and I was a 7 out of 10 on my ACEs score, and therefore that's why I'm an alcoholic now.
Yeah, I think that's such a. And again, I'm very ignorant here because like students will bring me like the assessments for ADHD and those kinds of things, and I'm just like, this is all that it really takes to really like be diagnosed. And again, I know that there's a lot of not controversies, maybe the wrong word, but debate over like the merit of the DSM. I know that's like not uncommon, and like maybe it's potentially a bit outdated, and like I think this new trauma movement has kind of brought a lot of it back into perspective. But I have a couple things I was wondering about because bring them closer was obviously your main one, but I think the resilience part with the cultural or the culture rebel for your other work, what was the kind of thought behind like what's the decision to write that book and what was your kind of main message there?
Culture Rebel was when I was a new mom with my oldest son, and just started to notice what moms were into. Like, now it was all about who had the best stroller, and like, have you got your body back? And
Yeah.
I taglined that because the world has enough desperate housewives. Like,
Yeah.
why are we not out there, like, creating what we want to see in the world? That
Hmm.
was the whole premise of that book. It was my dissatisfaction with this mommy world.
Okay.
That's where that came
Sorry.
from.
Okay. And so as you kind of unpack that book, like what were some things that like what message did you want people to take away? Like to stop kind of just thinking about those kind of traditional like material things and like start to I don't maybe fulfillment is the wrong word, but is that kind of the path that you wanted people to take from that?
Yeah, maybe fulfillment that's so much more than what we can get, but more what we can give. I'm
Mhm.
really big on this idea that we're all culture creators. I'm a culture creator of my home.
Mhm.
We're culture creators of our classrooms, and I think
Mhm.
sometimes we think, oh no, no, like if my principal was better, or if this was better, I'd
Mhm.
have a better. It's like no, wherever my little domain is, that's where I create, and I'm the culture creator there.
Okay. And so I think in your I could be wrong, but it was like called to be dangerous. Why the use of the word dangerous there?
That is interesting. Yeah, you're not called to be desperate, you're called to be dangerous. So again, it's
Okay.
that whole like desperate housewives. Doesn't that just
Mhm.
sound pathetic?
Yeah.
Desperate housewives.
Yeah, because it's
Um,
like you can be a self-fulfilled content housewife, but like the desperate one is not necessarily the ideal. Yeah.
it just sounds really, I don't know, like weak to me. Whereas
Mhm.
dangerous, it was like, what if I was dangerous for like, and at that time I was taking a bit of a break from teaching students because I had a new baby.
Mhm.
What if I was dangerous for the students that are coming into my class who feel like they have nothing to contribute to society? And I mean, what I mean by dangerous is what if I decided to be a disruptor in a good way for them?
Mhm.
What if I was able to offer them different points of view to see themselves differently? What if I saw
Mhm.
myself differently so that I could pass that on?
Yeah, I think the common thread always comes back to like how can I not reinvent, but ensure that I am approaching others in like the best emotional space possible. That seems to be, I think, the main goal for most, and I think that's kind of what you're trying to get at with your work. Um, but when you're kind of going about your, because right now I've noticed, again, I'm pretty early on in my teaching career, but one of the things I've noticed is that people will go down to teachers convention and they'll go down to kind of like some of these events and like I guess the running kind of joke is that it's going to be, oh, this is going to be very similar. I'm going to get the same messages of encouragement. But what would be like, what's kind of the main problems that you're hearing from teachers in the profession? And like in your work with educators, what have you noticed change?
Oh, so I've noticed, so in 25 years, when I first started working in those schools,
Hmm.
I noticed that there was a lot more capacity to go above and beyond the call of duty to really make sure that students succeed.
Hmm.
They didn't have the same red tape that there is now. They didn't have the same, they had expectations, but there seems to be more expectations. There seems to be more systemic problems. So, what I feel like when I'm talking to teachers about their own self care, I did a self care strategies that work in Edmonton. I had 600 teachers in that room. And the year before, I had 300. And I thought to myself, we're not doing something here. Like, that's what I'm hearing the most is burnout. I'm hearing dissatisfaction with the way the system is set up. I'm hearing I have too much being placed on my shoulders. And I do believe that there is more on the shoulders. I also think that we don't know how to handle a lot of capacity these days. And we're told that we shouldn't handle a lot of capacity. Whereas back maybe 25 years ago, it was like, let's change the world. And now it's like, let's have work life balance. And I don't know, I'm not saying either one is wrong.
Yeah.
I'm just noticing the
Hmm.
difference of language.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. 'Cause I guess I'm trying to figure out like there's like I think 86% of schools in the US are struggling to hire teachers, and there's like teacher shortages all over the place in Canada as well. And I mean, I'm just kind of doing my thing, teaching social, loving it. Like I don't know, I don't really see the. I mean, I just started a podcast because why not? I don't know, and I'm just trying to think like, what does it look like in 10, 15 years? Because the common thread I hear is pretty similar to exactly what you're saying. Is there's systemic expectations have changed. There's more pressure on the shoulders. Um, But yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of getting a not an outside perspective, but like an adjacent perspective from you, and kind of seeing what's going on there. Um, there's a couple more things I just want to talk to you about in terms of like titles from like some of your uh, chapters. So in your Bring Them Closer series, you talked about value based discipline. What was that? What are your?
So discipline
Mhm,
means to teach. That's the meaning of the word discipline.
mhm,
And so it's like, how, what do I want to teach these students? And a lot of times, we don't, I don't hear a lot about values anymore. And I know my grandparents, like they were hard workers. They were full of integrity. And they cared about those things. And they were constantly telling me, Connie, be integral, be a woman of character. If that's your word, you follow through. You never go back on your word. And these things got really instilled in me. And so whenever I did something wrong and I needed to be disciplined, it was based on you're not meeting the value. You're not living up to this value of integrity right now. It wasn't about you lied. And I think that I'd love to see a return to us calling young people to the values that they want. Maybe we even ask them, what do you value? And then we base any kind of teaching around behavior on, hey, that's kind of going against what you said you want for your life. Now that's probably more of a junior high school type of discipline.
mhm.
But I just think that that's one thing I noticed that's missing is this kind of like grounding of foundation in people's lives.
Like a lack of internal direction, almost. Because I would
Yeah.
say the idea of direction now is I know what I'm gonna study in post-secondary that's gonna make my parents happy. That
Oh,
is the but you know what I mean? That's kind of what I picked up on. If I have that down, then that means I have direction. I know where I'm going. But, like, I think there's competing ideas of what direction is. And I always say to the students, I'm like, you can like, there's people who are professional ice cream tasters for Ben& and Jerry's. Like, there's different things that you can pursue in life that's not just, like, your general again, there's nothing wrong with that either. Like, there's nothing wrong with kind of pursuing a traditional path, but I find when it comes to any sort of idea of, like, internal direction that's outside of a job pursuit is almost a null conversation. Like, they don't even wanna talk about it, which is strange. But yeah, I don't know. It's just something that I've thought of as well. But redesign your home. What was that one about?
well, so it's interesting because now my husband and I, we own a renovation company.
Okay.
And and it's all about re renovating home, not just renovating a physical
A
environment,
house.
but an emotional, mental, social environment as well. And when I first wrote that chapter, it was how do we create an environment for wellness? Again, it's not just paint on the wall, but it's also how am I emotionally cultivating the environment of my home? If we're always walking on eggshells around mom, then that's the environment.
We
That's
got
the
to build a
feel.
room to keep her in all day. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's
So
like
I guess,
how do you want to create your home? How do you want it to
mhm.
feel?
Well, and so that's kind of like, there's also like a running chain of like you connect experience with space when it
Yeah.
comes to trauma. Like again, the kind of cliche answer is like if you did experience like abuse as a child, like returning back to that home 20 years later is going to bring things up. So the idea that that space is not like tainted with whatever experiences were had there, I think it sounds very like getting into like a spiritual realm kind of conversation, but I think everyone experiences it and believes it, but are afraid to say it, which is
Ah,
weird. But that's kind of the but I guess what I'm wondering is how do you kind of apply that concept to the classroom? Like, are there like should teachers kind of be like changing up the layout of their room more often to kind of give it a new flair? Like, you know what I mean?
yeah, I have you would love this guy. He's a teacher, grade
Mhm.
5, and he's really into like hunting. And
Okay.
so he has made his room like just he's got like lights hanging from the ceiling and he's kind of like it looks like a guy's
Like a man
lodge,
cave.
man cave when you walk into his
Yeah,
room. And it's funny
yeah.
because I thought, well, wait a minute, like, wouldn't the girls disconnect from this? And he's like, no, no, they love it because it feels warm. But again, colors create moods. And so physically, I do think that taking time to put intention into a room, not a lot of
Mhm.
money, because that's not the
Yeah.
point, but
Yeah,
inten
and it's not really necessary either, really.
no,
Mm,
but the intention and what do we want our classrooms to feel like? But then also understanding that the physical part is not maybe as important as what do we want our classrooms to feel like, and how do we set up those classrooms to feel the way we
mhm.
want them to?
Yeah, and that kind of applies back to what we were talking about earlier, that every teacher kind of has a different role with different students. Like, if you have your authentic self kind of integrated into your room, then I think then a lot of that work will take care of itself.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to the way that you orient yourself will determine a lot of the outcomes and of the interactions you have. Would you kind of agree with that?
I would say you're bang on.
Okay. So I think there's one more I wanted to talk to you about was the status to love. I don't even know. I didn't actually read the chapter, but like, what was that? I think that was in. I can't even remember which book that was in. But the status to love
Yeah, that's
chapter.
in
Where were
Culture
you
Rebel.
going? Okay, yeah. So what was that?
Wow. I am
Yeah.
impressed with you, let me tell you.
Okay. Well.
So that's more about like our society is so much about status. You know,
Mhm,
how many Instagram followers do you have?
mhm,
How many people liked that post? Or how am I doing in my career? Did I get
mhm,
teacher of the month for 3 consecutive months? Like whatever it is, we all have this status, and even when it's not put with something physically tangible,
like
we
the
all
title
have it.
chasing. Yeah.
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 Instead, I'm like, what if we were rooted and grounded in love? In the sense of I love what I do, and I love what I bring to the table. What if I could do that? What if I just did it? There's a beautiful book called The Way to Love by Anthony DeMello, and he talks about compare the difference between, you know, succeeding and all the accolades to just producing something in private that you absolutely just delight in. Compare those two feelings. And that's kind of where I'm going with that.
Okay. Beautiful. Okay. Well, I have one more thing to ask you before we wrap up here. So I always kind of finish off the episodes asking my guests different. It's the same thing, I think. So there's a quote I heard once. It said, "Education is what remains once we forget everything that we learned in school." So, what is it that you want people to take away from their experience with you that is specific to you?
Oh, I honestly think that if people can find that deep rooted why you belong, like what is your unique contribution, and to be brave with it, to create something that only you could create,
Mhm.
then I think our world would be doing really well. In that, in how do you parent, how do you teach, to bring that unique contribution and not be worried about when it doesn't look like everyone else, when it doesn't look like the person next to you. I know for me in mental health and resilience, the way I go about it is very different than say a typical somebody else. And sometimes it gets me in trouble, and sometimes people connect so deeply with it because it's true and authentic to me. And I've noticed
Mhm.
when that happens, that's really beautiful and it keeps me going. And so I would love for others to experience that too.
Beautiful. So, what's next for you?
Well, I'm writing Bring Them Closer for couples now.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Well, I'm excited to talk to you again about when that book comes out.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on. Appreciate it. And anything that you want to say to finish off here?
Oh, I just want to say that you're an absolute delight to talk to, and I just
Uh,
love how deep you think about things.
well, I thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Thanks. Have a good day.